John Calvin, John Wesley, Charles Spurgeon, and Matthew Henry all agreed on something that might shock you. They believed Jesus was actually the Archangel Michael before his incarnation. Today, we're exploring this fascinating theological perspective that Michael was Jesus' heavenly identity, revealing God's character of self-giving love and how it fulfills John 3:16 through divine humility both in heaven and on earth. By the end of this episode, you'll understand how this view transforms our understanding of God's nature and what it means for divine love to be truly self-sacrificial. Let me bring in someone who's been diving deep into early Christian theology to help us unpack this. What's the actual evidence that early Protestant scholars saw Michael as the pre-incarnate Christ?
The evidence is actually pretty substantial. According to the International Standard Bible Encyclopedia from 1930, quote, "The earlier Protestant scholars usually identified Michael with the pre-incarnate Christ, finding support for their view not only in the juxtaposition of the child and the archangel in Revelation 12, but also in the attributes ascribed to him in Daniel."
Wait, so this wasn't just a fringe idea?
Not at all. We're talking about major figures: Theodore Beza, John Wesley, Adam Clarke, John Gill, Matthew Henry, Charles Spurgeon. John Calvin himself wrote in his commentary on Daniel that he embraced the opinion of those who refer Michael to the person of Christ because, quote, "It suits the subject best to represent him as standing forward for the defense of his elect people."
That's incredible. But I have to ask, doesn't this make Jesus a created angel? That seems problematic.
That's the key misconception. According to the research, this view doesn't mean Jesus is a created angel at all. The sources make it clear that Michael is described as increated, existing without being created, as the second person of the Trinity. The term archangel implies command over angels, not being a created angel.
So it's more about his role than his nature?
Exactly. The evidence shows Michael is superior to the angel Gabriel, and he's the only archangel ever named in Scripture. Plus, his name literally means "who is like unto God," and according to these scholars, the answer is Christ himself, as seen in Philippians 2:5-7 and Hebrews 1:1-4.
That's fascinating. But here's what I'm really curious about. How does this connect to the idea of self-giving love? What does this tell us about God's character?
This is where it gets really profound. If Jesus was Michael before the incarnation, it means his humility didn't start on earth. It was already part of his heavenly identity. He was already in a position of service, defending God's people, even in heaven.
So you're saying humility is baked into who God is, not just something he did for us?
That's exactly right. And this connects beautifully to John 3:16. When we read, "For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son," we're not just seeing a one-time act of love, we're seeing the revelation of God's eternal character of self-giving.
But let me push back a little. Isn't there a risk here of diminishing the significance of the incarnation? If Jesus was already humble in heaven, what makes his earthly humility so special?
Great question, but I think it actually amplifies the incarnation's significance. Look at Philippians 2:6-7, "Who, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant."
So it's like a double humility?
In a sense, yes. First, the eternal Son takes on the role of Michael, the defender, the servant of God's people. Then, he goes even further and takes on human flesh. It's humility upon humility, revealing that self-giving love is at the very core of who God is.
That's a beautiful way to think about it. And this connects to something I've been thinking about. How does this change our understanding of what love actually means?
Well, according to Derek Prince Ministries, God's divine love is unique because it is self-giving, it goes the second mile, it is unconditional. But if Jesus was Michael, we see this wasn't just demonstrated on earth, it was his eternal nature.
So when Jesus says in John 15:9, as the Father loved me, I too have loved you, he's revealing something that was always true about divine love?
Exactly. And Bishop Michael Curry wrote that Jesus showed what love looks like, giving of the self, even sacrificing the self for the good and well-being of others. If Jesus was Michael, this self-giving was his eternal identity, not just his earthly mission.
This is really reshaping how I think about the Trinity. It's not just that God decided to love us, love is who he is.
Right. And John 3:16 becomes even more powerful when you realize it's not describing a change in God's heart, but a revelation of his eternal heart. The verse says God so loved, describing both degree and manner, love displayed in concrete action that was always part of his nature.
But I'm curious about something else. If this view was so common among early Protestant scholars, why don't we hear about it more today?
That's a great question. Richard Carrier notes that while there's a good case to be made for this view, it's still considered an intriguing possibility with some support in the evidence, but not something one can reliably prove. Modern scholarship tends to be more cautious about these connections.
So it's not that the evidence disappeared, but that our standards for certainty have changed?
Exactly. And there's also been a shift away from what Michael F. Bird calls dive-in ontology, questions about what God actually is, toward focusing more on functions and titles. But Bird argues that ontological language was used to describe Jesus from the earliest decades of the church.
That's really interesting. So we might have lost something important by moving away from these deeper questions about God's nature?
I think so. When we focus only on what Jesus does rather than who he is, we might miss the profound truth that self-giving love isn't just God's strategy, it's his essence. The incarnation reveals what was always true about divine love.
And that brings us back to John 3:16. When it says God gave his son, it's not just about the cross, it's about revealing the giving nature that was always there?
Precisely. The verse unveils divine love as self-giving. As one analysis puts it, unlike deistic or impersonal conceptions, the verse depicts a God who moves toward rebels, bearing the cost himself. This movement toward us reflects his eternal character.
You know what strikes me about this? It completely changes how we think about power. Usually we think power means getting your way, but divine power seems to be about giving yourself away.
That's such an important insight. The research on Jesus' humility shows that despite possessing all authority, he submitted to the will of the Father. If he was Michael, this pattern of powerful humility was his eternal mode of being.
So when Jesus washes the disciples' feet, he's not just teaching them something new, he's showing them who he's always been?
Exactly. And this connects to something Keith Giles wrote about how Jesus refuses to participate in the tit-for-tat game of desire, showing us a new way, self-giving love. But if he was Michael, this wasn't a new way for him, it was his eternal way.
This is really profound. It means that when we see Jesus' humility on earth, we're getting a glimpse into the very heart of the Trinity.
Right. And the incarnation becomes this incredible act where, as one source puts it, Jesus, fully God and fully man, descended from his heavenly glory to reveal God to humanity. He's revealing what was always true about divine love through his earthly humility.
But let me ask this, if God's nature is self-giving love, what does that mean for us? How should this change how we live?
Well, if we're made in God's image and this is who God truly is, then self-giving love isn't just a nice ideal, it's what we're designed for. As Derek Prince put it, real love doesn't just give things, but gives itself.
So it's not about trying to be good, it's about becoming who we actually are?
Exactly. And this connects to what Paul writes in Philippians 2:3-4. Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. We're called to reflect the same humility that was Christ's eternal identity.
This really reframes everything. It's not that God decided to love us despite who he is, he loves us because of who he is.
That's beautifully put. And John 3:16 becomes this incredible window into God's eternal heart. When it says God so loved the world, it's revealing the self-giving love that defines his very being, whether as Michael in heaven or Jesus on earth.
You know, there's something really comforting about this. It means God's love for us isn't conditional or changeable, it's who he is.
Absolutely. And if Jesus was Michael, then even before the incarnation, God was already in the business of defending and protecting his people. His love has always been active, always self-giving, always moving toward us.
This brings up something interesting, though. If this view reveals such beautiful truths about God's character, why do you think it's not more widely taught today?
I think partly because we've become more cautious about making definitive claims without absolute proof, but also because we sometimes prefer our theology neat and tidy, and this view requires us to hold mystery and certainty together.
That's a good point. Maybe we've lost something by always needing to have everything figured out perfectly.
Right. And the early Protestant scholars weren't afraid to embrace this view because they saw how it enriched their understanding of God's character. Calvin said it suits the subject best. Sometimes theological beauty points toward truth.
So when we step back from all this, what's the big picture? What does this perspective on Michael as Jesus' heavenly identity really teach us about God?
It teaches us that self-giving love isn't just something God does, it's who God is. From Michael defending God's people in heaven to Jesus dying on the cross, we see one consistent character, a God whose very nature is to give himself for others.
And John 3:16 becomes this incredible revelation of God's eternal heart, not just a description of what he decided to do for us.
Exactly. Whether we can prove definitively that Jesus was Michael or not, this perspective opens up a beautiful truth, that divine humility and self-giving love are at the very core of who God is, from eternity to eternity.
And that changes everything about how we understand love, power, and what it means to be truly divine. Here's what I want you to take away from this conversation. The next time you read John 3:16, remember that you're not just seeing God's decision to love you, you're seeing a window into his eternal heart. Whether Jesus was Michael or not, the truth remains, self-giving love isn't just what God does, it's who God is. And just like those early Protestant scholars who weren't afraid to see divine beauty in unexpected places, maybe we need to be open to the mystery that God's love for us runs deeper than we ever imagined. Thanks for joining us on Copilot Podcasts.